All right, so welcome back for our second public talk. The speaker is going to be Chandra Sripada, but before he talks, we're going to have an introduction by Uri Mose. Uri?
Thank you. I sense that today somehow the internet reception where I am is quite bad. And I've recorded so I've pre-recorded an introduction. I think I will ask Tien to play it back rather than to get a fade in and out and there's noise behind me and so on. So Tien, if you could just please play that back. And yeah, I'm even sitting in my study and not here. So it looks like I'm more studious.
Professor Chandra Sripada holds a joint appointment at the University of Michigan in the Department of Philosophy and at the Department of Computational Medicine and Bioinformatics and Psychiatry. He also co-directs the university's Neuroimaging Methods Core. Such an unusual interdisciplinary appointment follows his unusual interdisciplinary path of obtaining an MD from the University of Texas Medical School in 1998, with an internship in psychiatry at UCSF and a residency in psychiatry at Michigan. That achievement would satisfy most people, but apparently not him. He thus went on to obtain a Ph.D. in philosophy from Rutgers University in 2006, and it is therefore only fitting that we would ask him to speak to our unusual interdisciplinary group. His research combines ethics and moral psychology to investigate the sense of agency and self-control from both a philosophical theoretical perspective, as well as using empirical methods in psychology, neuroscience, and psychiatry. He has made various contributions to philosophy. He worked on ethics, philosophy of mind, and action theory. He has recently written on self-regulation or willpower, intentional action, free will, and on norms. On the science side, he investigates the cognitive and neural mechanisms underpinning regulation of emotion, attention, and motor responses in ADHD, and substance abuse disorders, more recently from a neurodevelopmental perspective. He is further interested in the methodology underpinning neuroimaging, in particular machine learning, pattern classification, whole brain connectomics, affective connectivity, graph theory, and multimodal methods. He is the recipient of the Stanton Award by the Society of Philosophy and Psychology and the Don Klein Early Career Investigator Award from the Anxiety and Depression Association of America, among others. From all of that, I can only conclude that the John Templeton Foundation, which has often funded Chandra, and the Fetzer Institute have no sense. If they had any sense, they would have told us when we applied for funding that instead of funding our large group, they would be better off just funding Chandra, who embodies in one person what we are all trying to do together. They would have certainly saved on travel funds, as he does not need to visit himself to carry out his proposed research, which also makes his research quarantine-proof. With this, let me welcome Chandra Sripada to give the philosophy talk at the annual meeting of the Neurophilosophy of Free Will Consortium. His talk is titled The Atoms of Agency, Computational Neuroscience, Buddhist Philosophy of Mind, and Achieving Moral Responsibility.
Fantastic. Great intro, Uri. Thank you very much.
Although I must say that was recorded before you changed the title of your talk, so I'll let you give the correct title.
Yeah. You've got to save that video and send it to me. I want to play it to my kids when they're teenagers. They'll finally respect me.
So before you start, Chandra, I just wanted to say for the people who are attending that have access to the participant part, if you have questions, please put that in the chat. For people who don't have access, you can put questions in your Q&A. So we're going to hold questions until the end of Chandra's talk, and then I'll take questions from the participants and then look for questions from the Q&A. All right, so thank you very much, and now we'll move on to Chandra.
Yeah, so now I share my screen, I think, right?
Yeah.
Okay, let's do that. Share. And are you looking at my screen now?
Yep.
Okay, beautiful. Thank you again, Uri, for the terrific introduction. Is your viewing being obscured by this panel at all? Or are you just seeing the entirety of the screen? In other words, are you viewing your own face?
I'm seeing your slideshow plus the faces.
Okay, let me slide this over then. Let's see if that helps. Yeah.
There's nothing obscuring your slide.
Yeah, people can minimize the window themselves so that
Well,
there's...
I minimized it. So this should be good right here.
Everything is fine.
Okay.
We can see you well. Please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Thanks to this group for inviting me. I'm really excited to do this talk. And, you know, this is very much a work in progress. It's killing me that people cannot ask questions during the talk. So if you want to do that, actually, I'll just violate the rules. If you want to, sorry, somebody just walked in. If you want to, maybe we can. Let's see. So let's establish the subject matter. Suppose you're sitting on a bus wide awake, it's dark, there isn't anyone near you. Is your mind completely quiet? The answer for most is no, there's a succession of thoughts that happens next. This is, I started by saying the stream of consciousness, but now I'll give it just a slightly more technical name, the spontaneous stream of thought, SST. I'll be using that throughout. It's the ideas and images that meander across your mind, typically when you are unoccupied, and it has a phenomenology of effortlessness. Why do we care about SST at all? And I'll give you some quick reasons why we should care about it. Spontaneous thinking is a ubiquitous activity. The data here is hard to come by, but I think you can just notice your own everyday patterns. Yes, spontaneous thinking is everywhere. The neuroscientist Marcus Raichle called it the dark matter of the mind. Actually, he said energy, but matter is better, so I changed his quote. It has immense practical importance, and this was my introduction to the spontaneous stream of thought. If you try to drill down on what differentiates mental disorders and what is the root of their kind of pathophysiology, you get to SST very quickly. ADHD has chaotic thought patterns. Anxiety, depression have ruminative, negatively biased thought patterns. Schizophrenia has nonlinear. Bipolar has racing. If you knew the mechanisms of SST, you would know a lot about what goes on in many mental illnesses. And then there's the philosophical importance. SST, and this will become more apparent as I talk, is a really great testing grounds for thinking about agency, both in producing SST and then towards the end, I'll turn to regulating SST. Okay. Every talk needs a set of positions that can work as a foil. I'll be working with Galen, what I think are very standard views. SST involves passivity and associationistic transitions. So in a terrific paper that rewards deep reading, Strawson says, we're just passive with respect to all our thoughts. If we consider things plainly, we find most of our thoughts and thought contents just happen. They spring up, the process is automatic, action and intention need have little to do with it. Then he says, that's how it is for me at any rate. And then Metzinger says in a great paper in Frontiers, SST just arises from subpersonal processing. I claim that, and there is this data that 2/3 of our lives are spent in our waking lives, spent quote unquote mind wandering, which is very close to this notion of SST. And he says that's a time that we lose mental autonomy because this subpersonal kind of thinking takes over. Hume famously said, so if you ask, well, if it's subpersonal, what is that subpersonal mechanism doing? And then the claim is it's associationistic. And that's a widely viewed, widely endorsed kind of idea, even in the contemporary literature. And he says, our thoughts are related by the principles of association, and these are the only ties of our thoughts. Okay, so I've done the introduction part of the talk. What is SST? I've told you about it, and some dominant views, the passivity and associationistic view of SST. I'm now going to do something which is a little bit almost like a detour in some ways. I'm very quickly going to go through some empirical findings from my lab about SST. And this is very condensed, and I apologize for that ahead of time. It has to be this way because usually the talk is just the empirical findings, and I've just condensed them so you get a flavor of the empirical findings. But I understand that this is a long kind of session we have, so you can definitely ask in more detail about the empirical findings in the Q&A. So we studied SST with the talk aloud method, and that automatically, you know, bells go off and red flags get raised. So subjects are in a room, it's dark, there isn't any external stimulation. They're told about the kinds of situations in which SST arises, like you're sitting on a bus all alone. And then they get the hang of it pretty quickly and they narrate their thoughts for 30 minutes. Typically, you know, they'll say, this is weird is the first thing they'll say. I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do here. And then they just start doing it. So we transcribe their thoughts sentence by sentence and we apply the machine learning methods, these text analytic methods, to get some quantitative data about the structure. Yes, there are really important red flags. I'm not, and this is a philosophy audience, I bet you the methodology is looming on people's minds, but maybe I'll just put that aside. First study was 27 subjects, second 34, 20,000 lines of thoughts. So that's a lot of work for the undergrads to transcribe. Here's just to get a feel for this. It's impossible to talk about this data without giving an example. The family is coming up for my birthday. It's coming up. It'll be nice to see my sister. My mom got to make sure the house is clean, make sure it'll look nice. Do it this weekend. The room is cold. Wish I brought my jacket. Back is sore. Hope I get a good table at lunch. Don't want to sit alone. People looking at me, thinking I have no friends. By the way, when we got this data, we didn't know how to analyze it. It started with just pure qualitative analysis. And what we noticed is this kind of structure is in the data. So, by the way, the data is propositionalized. Ordinary speech comes in messy run-ons and we chop it so that a single proposition, and there's some grammatical stuff that goes with that, is expressed on each line. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, those are the propositions. And then this is the structure that really leapt out at us, these jumps. I'm sorry, I just get this weird thing where I can't see anybody out there. People are there with me out there?
Yes.
Yes,
Good,
we're here.
okay,
Yes.
I'll keep going, thank you.
We're here.
A
We're
little
here.
bit of validation, all right.
But by the way, I think if you press the escape button, then you can see both the faces and but maybe I'm wrong.
Oh, okay. Well, you know, you've already reassured me that I'm not talking to an empty screen, so I'm just going to take it on faith that that'll continue.
If you widen your screen, you can see both the pictures and the PowerPoint display.
Yeah, I'm on this tiny laptop, so yeah. Well, okay. But I'll press on. So you see this kind of discontinuous jump, and that's one very notable feature. And here's some terminology. These individual sentences, we call that a thought. These clusters of thoughts that are flanked by jumps, we call those blocks or clumps. And then there is this clearly, in discourse analysis, there's this term topic. It's what a unit of discourse is about. And there's clearly these topics that are associated with each of these blocks. And what we found in qualitative analysis of the pilot subjects is we already had a kind of working model of what goes on in spontaneous thought, and we call it a clump and jump structure. So you have a topic that is the basis for a set of connected thoughts, and then at some point you have this kind of fairly discontinuous jump, and then you have another cluster of thoughts about another topic and another jump. So that's the clump and jump structure. What is the evidence for that other than it seemed like that to us? I'll review the evidence very quickly. So we had raters, 3 of them, go through and assign where they think that the topic is switching and the subject is now in a different clump, different block. And the inter-rater reliability is 0.67, which is statistically is the p-value of 0. It's not great reliability, but it's certainly not bad, indicating that individuals are seeing the same phenomenon in the data independently. All subjects have a clump and jump pattern. It's not unique to just some subjects. We also use these, we use a deep learning encoder to measure the semantic similarity between pairs of sentences. What we find is that in sentences that are within blocks, so these are these blue pairs, the semantic similarity is higher than at these red blocks. The p-value there, the difference is a Cohen's d of about 1.2, and the p-value is 0. So these effects are pretty big. You don't need subjects to assign those blocks, those jumps. You can use a data-driven community detection algorithm, and it'll assign the jumps much better than you would expect by chance. Interestingly, when you look at whether the blocks themselves are related, so you can talk about a target block here, a cluster of sentences. Here's the lag 1 block. Here's the lag 2 block. Are these related? It turns out the answer is essentially no. The lag 1 block is statistically significantly related to the target block, but it's minimal. And the lag 2 block is no more related to the target block than the target block is to distant blocks. So at each one of these jumps, you're doing something, you're switching to a place that's pretty discontinuous. We also looked in whether, is this just an artifact of people verbalizing their thoughts? And we did a study where people make a mark on a piece of paper every time they introspect that their thoughts are shifting to a different topic. And you find clump and jump structure there, indicated by the fact that the number of jumps is such that they're spending a significant duration in between jumps, indicating they're having a clump. Okay, so we believe that there is clump and jump structure in the spontaneous stream of thought. We also did this experiment, which I think is fairly cool, and I'll walk through this one in a little bit more detail. Your goals and values are highly manifested in SST. So in this study, it's a 2-session study. Subjects in session 1, they do a bunch of things in session 1, but one of the things they do is a personal concerns interview. And we extract from them 3 personal concerns across 10 domains, so a total of 30 personal concerns. These are things that are important to them in their life. 2 weeks later, they do a bunch more things, including this SST session. And when I say that we do a bunch of things, it's not so obvious to them that what they did in this interview is connected to what we're looking for over here. In our debriefing, it doesn't look like they're aware of what we're looking for is whether these personal concerns show up over here. We do semantic analysis, and we use a pretty cool analysis. I won't go through the details, but we look at whether your personal concerns are more related to your SST versus length matched Wikipedia sentences. And another analysis, we look at everybody else's SST. And both analyses show that your personal concerns are showing up in your SST. Okay. In short, all of that is just to say that we have some empirical sense of what the spontaneous stream of thought looks like. And our model of it is what I said before. You have these thoughts, they're the red arrows where you're elaborating on a thought within a clump, within a block. Then you have a place where you then switch and you go look for a new topic. Interestingly, the topic search is heavily influenced by your own goals, values, and personal concerns. And then you spend some time there, and then you jump, and so on and so forth. Okay. I'm actually fine if people want to ask questions right now. Any questions?
I have a question.
I do have a question, actually.
Yeah,
Okay,
please.
and then John.
So do you think that the, do you think that that the personal interview you give actually influences the SST that you get? I mean, there they are having to come up with concerns, and maybe that actually determines the SST. Maybe you get a different SST than you would if you did the SST before the interview.
Yeah, well, that's an excellent point, and we did not counterbalance. And it had to do with the nature of the subject pool that we used to do this. In any case, I can only say that there is nothing, we don't debrief with the subjects about the nature of our inquiry until the end of the second session. And while I've set it up, cueing you in that this interview is related to the SST session that they do 2 weeks later, I don't think it's particularly obvious that we would then go in and look in their transcripts for the SST for the personal concerns that they mentioned earlier. That said, I cannot rule out the direction of causality that you are pointing out. It's just a weakness of our design that could be the case. I will say, though, that I was lazy in not putting enough citations here. The idea that your personal concerns end up in your spontaneous thoughts is actually from Eric Klinger way back in the 1970s, and he has his own analyses using diary methods that back it up. There's a weird thing going on here where if I told you your personal concerns show up in your SST, you'd probably go, well, duh, of course. We're kind of chasing down and trying to nail and get clear statistical, empirical evidence for a claim that is a little bit commonsensical. So with all those, I would say that the evidence still supports the idea that your goals and values are expressed in your spontaneous thoughts.
Okay, we also have a question from John Dylan Haynes.
Good. So I'll take that question and then I'll go on to the next one. And thanks for the back and forth. I do like that.
You shouldn't have offered to take questions on the way. So I don't know if you get this a lot, but when you present this data to me, it seems that I would want to be really convinced that there is some kind of discontinuous nature here, where you have like some stages where it's kind of the distance is low, and then you make a jump. And because similarity structure in these kind of high dimensional semantic spaces can be all over the place. So, and when you just show the distributions you showed just now, you take the Wikipedia page and you take the utterances, it seems that there's like a continuous distribution. So because it's a strong statement to say that you stop somewhere, you rest, you kind of think with a little semantic or narrow range, and then you jump to the next topic. Is there anything that really, because I could just put a vertical line in here and say, everything to the left of that.
Hold on, John Dylan. I want to make clear that this is a completely different analysis than this. Okay. And so what this analysis is, and you guys can see my cursor, this analysis is the analysis where we're comparing the blue with the red. That analysis does show exactly what you said, that there is, so that's there's multiple ways to do the analysis, but you can look at the average of the blues versus the average of the red. And that's one way to do it. And so that is showing that the blues are Cohen's D 1.2 larger than the red, which is exactly the kind of evidence that you wanted. Now, I will caveat this, that this kind of result can happen, that you can have clear increased discontinuities at these jumps, even if there are subtle connections across the two blocks. So for example, a sequential connection can do that. Here's in graphical terms, this would be an example of a kind of a small world network where, without going to that, I'll just give an example. If you're thinking about what happened on graduation night, you might think of the commencement ceremony, which is at the auditorium. And then the next event that you think about is when you all went to the lake and jumped in the water. I'm actually thinking my own high school graduation with this. Those are connected events, but the semantic similarity, you're going to have a massive increase in dissimilarity right when you transition from the event at the auditorium to the lake, but they are connected. So our crude methods may miss certain kinds of connections that exist across these jumps. I do want to flag that. I will say, though, from a qualitative analysis of the data, you get a lot of transitions that look like this. I'll do it on the weekend. The room is too cold. It's just not plausible that those are subtle associative transitions that our method is missing. It's just that the person is jumping. And so, you know, that's an argument a little bit from my own personal view. So we're confident that there is clump and jump structure.
It's okay. It's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to let you take one question from the audience right now. So Rahul Patel asks, what makes the end of a, have you looked to see what makes the end of a thought block the end? You know, is there a reason that there's a jump there?
Well, so I'm going to speculate coming up. You'll see that all of this talk is speculation. So there's plenty of, thank you, Rahul, and I'll speculate on that coming up. I will say very briefly, this is a different analysis, and I won't go into the details, but what this is showing is not about clump and jump. What this is showing is that your personal concerns show up in your SST session later. And there is a smooth kind of curve here, but the important thing is the skewness of this distribution, or there's more mass in this distribution over here at the high matches than this distribution over here. In any case, I'll just keep going.
Okay.
Now for a big switch. Buddhism. I gave this talk in Virginia in the fall of last year. Zach Irving, who is going to be the next leading philosophical researcher in mind wandering, invited me out there. And I met the Buddhists in the audience who told me a lot about the way the Buddhists thought about SST. So I'll share you a little summary of my view on how Buddhists think about SST, which I just think is super cool and is illuminating about the question of agency in SST. So the Buddhists have a really distinct mereological approach to mind, which is just completely unbelievable that this is all taking place, you know, thousands, you know, 500 BC up until 200 to 400 AD. So they conceived of mind as a sequence of mind moments. And the moments are very small. The moment is, you're talking hundreds of milliseconds or smaller. And each moment has a characteristic structure that they describe as a frame. And every frame, these moments are not just independent of each other. Prior frames condition future ones condition subsequent ones. And the frames, the ambition of this kind of project, which is they're looking at micro events going on in these individual frames that are occurring very rapidly. And they're saying that there's all this structure in those frames. What kind of structure? It's structure that looks like this. There is contact between sense organs and a sense object. They add that the mind itself is a kind of recipient organ, and it can take a mind, thoughts, concepts. Every ordinary concepts can also be things that come in contact with the mind organ. So there's a route in at this arrow and this arrow. And what happens next is a flow information kind of picture. There's a kind of percept that generates, a percept that involves a content, a kind of bare awareness. Interestingly, feeling is connascent with the presence of perception. So they have a kind of Robert Zion's idea that the feeling happens very rapidly. And so you have this kind of content that you can think of as a kind of description, stripped of rich conceptualization and embedding in more complex thought formations. And that's what happens next. These mental formations occur. And in those mental formations, what comes out of it is a richly contextualized thought that might involve elaboration, proximal inference involving the bare content, and contextualization of that content. And that happens very rapidly. And interestingly, they would say that decision, it's translated in different ways, but decision or intention or impulsion, some motivational notion is right in there in these formations. And so they put agency right in these micro moments. And it has a looping structure. So the thought complex that comes here can certainly become an input to the mind organ. It becomes the mind object that the mind organ contacts, and it can go through again. So you can have a thought complex that comes through as a content and gets elaborated further. and proximal inference occurs with regard to that. And that can keep on happening. It can be, of course, interrupted with salient external things, but a lot of what they describe is this process of proliferation. And so that can happen all the time, and you can get one thought after another. And interestingly, they had the idea that, and this is a bare skeleton involving just the basic notion of these mental formations and factors. And they said a lot of other occasional factors can come into play. And Vitika and Vichara are among them. And the picture is that Vitika is this kind of, at this stage here in the mental formation, Vitika is a mental operation that can grab onto a content, and Vichara is a mental faculty that can, in a reverberating way, elaborate it. I like the picture, a bronze gong, which initially is struck, that's Vitika, and then the elaboration repeatedly, that's Vichara. And they said, these operations happening like that, these, by the way, they don't look that primitive, and that's the idea. These could probably reducible to more basic mental operations. That would be acknowledged in the picture. Vitika and Vichara, they would say is that's how you get discursive thought, and that looks a lot like clump and jump. Interestingly, and this will become important for what I say a little bit later, they had the idea that other things can come in. So you have these mental factors, they're operating rapidly, they're producing contextualized thought, but you can intervene in it by means of these attentional faculties. These are other things that can operate. Now, a curious question is, where do they come from? It looks a little bit like an external thing that isn't given a clear account. And that is true. And I've been kind of pressing some of my Buddhist colleagues about that. But they do have this idea that even at this very basic micro level, you can intervene on the unfolding of these decisions, and you can change the thought content and the elaboration that occurs. It's a beautiful picture. It's super interesting. And one thing that I like about it is it puts agency right at the heart of SST. And remember, earlier, I talked about Strawson's view that we're passive with respect to SST, Metzinger's view that this is just subpersonal, and the associationistic picture of Hume. Well, this is a different picture that seems to disagree in a lot of ways. It says there's a lot more structure in SST. It's clump and jump and can involve inference, elaboration, and things that we would call kind of propositional thought, and also that there's agency very much in it. Okay, I'm going to press forward. I'm using the Buddhist view here because, first of all, I think it's fascinating. Second, it's a kind of evidence. I mean, these people were introspecting very carefully, and maybe I'll get to this a little bit later, but I think that if you have strictures against the use of introspection in psychology, you should be careful about when you think you can't use it. Many of us would agree that our current thoughts are introspectable. It may be possible that what the Buddhists were doing here can serve as evidence that there is agency and there is richer structure in SST. Now I want to turn to my own kind of picture of how SST works. I think that there is agency in SST, so I disagree with the Strawson and the Metzinger view. And one helpful way to think about it is there is this kind of continuum between simple responses. Some things are not even a response. Eye color is not a response. A suntan is a kind of response. A reflex is a response, but it doesn't have the right kind of mental antecedents. Some things clearly have agency behind them, deliberative actions, caused by conscious beliefs, desires, and reasoning. And then there's this huge gray area here, and we don't know quite what to say. One way to carve out this area is to say that's the subpersonal stuff. And I think that is one important kind of impetus in contemporary philosophy. Yeah, the habits are subpersonal. Interestingly, if you look in action theory, there's very little work on habits. I talked to Al Mealy, who's on this call, I think, about it, and he said he knows of the Bill Pollard stuff, not a whole lot else. So there's definitely scope to get clear on what's going on with this intermediate stuff. Maybe the implicit bias work does get closer to this area. In any case, I think that The natural kind here is the class of mental responses that have a decisional basis. And this stuff here has a minimal decisional basis. And I want to say more about what I think a minimal decision is and why it does have the right kind of structure to be an expression of agency. So that's where I'm turning to now. What is a minimal decision? Minimal decisions combine subpersonal value computation with person-level choice. An example. This is an old example, the Iowa gambling task. It's not used so much more anymore because it has some poor statistical properties. But in any case, it's just a great example. Subjects make roughly 100 sequential choices from one to four decks. One of four decks. They get feedback every trial. They know whether they'll win or lose. Unbeknownst to the subjects, some of the decks are bad decks. They lead to some, you lose money if you keep selecting from them. Some decks are good, and they have to learn this. And we now know that this kind of problem is solved by subpersonal iterative value calculation. So this is the temporal difference learning rule. Nobody could articulate this. It took work by computer scientists and neuroscientists to figure out that this rule is probably operational in our own psychology. But these commodities and these quantities are being computed in our psychology. And we're not so much aware of it. And this is the right kind of thing to call subpersonal. Now, these quantities probably are associated with gut feelings. And that's an important point that Damasio and Baccara made with these initial studies. You kind of have an initial phenomenon, you have a state with a kind of valenced phenomenal character associated with selecting from these decks. So it's not like when you're selecting, you view your own selection as completely obscure to you. You have a hunch about it. And then that's actually the word that Baccara used to characterize what goes on in this experiment. What happens next is that these quantities serve as decision weights. That is, these value computations that you associate to the decks, these value serve as decision weights in a choice process. And choice processes have the structure of a drift diffusion process. I'm characterizing them as a race process here. There's a lot of different ways to characterize them that are equivalent. And so the less valued deck has a less steep slope. The more valued deck has a steeper slope. These processes evolve under conditions of noise until they hit a boundary. But the subpersonal meets the personal right there. A race process hitting the boundary causes or is identical to a person level event. You're choosing option one. And so this decision process is caused by, your decision is caused by a subpersonal process, but it does have the right kind of characteristics, especially these gut feelings, to rationalize what you do. And being caused and rationalized is a decent account of what it is to produce something that is in the sphere of an action. Okay, so I've told you what a minimal decision is. It's not like the ordinary, the way that decision is being used here is not like when you choose between majoring in medicine versus the arts. That's a folk psychological notion of decision. It involves deliberation and consideration and consciousness and things like that. This is a minimal decision.
So Chandra,
yes,
since you're taking questions, I'll ask one.
Good.
So why would you automatically think that a race process, diffusion to bound is a person level thing? So we see it in the brain at all different kinds of level of cortex, levels where we don't think things are available to person level, even awareness of the result. And yeah, I'm just wondering aren't we looking for something a little more than that?
Yeah, but I mean, what I said was that value calculation and this diffusion to bound is sufficient for what I'm calling a minimal decision. I didn't say that, I'm sorry, that when these conditions are in place, one has a minimal decision. Well, I want to, yeah, you're right. I need to weaken this. I was thinking about what I should say about cases that are buried deep in, let's say, early perception and things like that. for now, I'll punt on that. In characterizing a minimal decision this way, I would need to weaken it to weed out cases where there is no access consciousness for consuming psychological systems for something. I would need something like that. So the role of these gut feelings, as I understand them, is to broadcast the information about these value currencies to a bunch of consumer systems that can then use them for choice and things like that. So it would have to be part of the story that certain kinds of value calculation and choice processes meet the criterion for a minimal decision. I accept that your criticism, Adina.
And Till wants to ask if decisions are races, why do choices feel effortful? Sometimes feel effortful.
Well, yeah, you know, this is really at the level of several hundred millisecond type choices. And the notion of effort associated with choice are probably going to be difficult choices. And that's back in the zone of the folk psychological notion of decision. And so I think when the cases can differ. I mean, effort can occur in, for example, a choice in a Stroop task, which I'll talk about momentarily. But for the most part, when we associate effort with choice, it's often in the folk psychological sense of effort and choice and decision, which is not what I'm referring to here. Okay, I'll proceed on. With the notion of minimal decision in play, just note that it's plausible that minimal decisions like this are ubiquitous in our psychology. And so classic lexical decision tasks, saccading and looking at a visual scene, doing an iterated trust game. This is the, and I'll spend a little bit more time with this one. This is a verbal fluency task, and the person is asked, name as many animals as you can. And they start with a cluster in mind, like a farm animal cluster, and they stay with that for a while. And then suddenly they switch to another cluster. And that's described by this kind of value calculation algorithm, the marginal value stay or go algorithm. Won't go into the details there. And it is associated with kind of phenomenologically marked kind of states that you feel a sense that, well, I'm running out of options over here. I'm getting tired of this one. There's probably another kind of category I can switch to. So it meets broadly, it fits nicely the kind of criterion that minimal decisions are going on in this kind of process. So I'm just noting that minimal decisions are probably ubiquitous in our psychology. And how do you know that they're there? Like I said, look for algorithms with expected utility computation, preferably ones that have kind of phenomenological counterpart, marking with sense of effort, depletion, frustration, things like that going on, and diffusion to bound kinds of processes. There is some indirect evidence that those kinds of processes are going on in SST. So let me review what I think are two important lines of evidence. You might have noticed that the clump and jump structure in SST looks a lot like the cluster and switch stay or go decisions that happen in this verbal fluency task that I've described over here. They look a lot like foraging decisions. And foraging decisions have this kind of iterated quality where at every unit time, you're asking the question again and again of yourself, should I stay or should I go? And your decision is predicated on the value computations that you are making and you are updating in real time. So this is kind of like a little schematic diagram of what these foraging decisions look like. The green triangle is the decision. Should you jump to find a new topic, or should you stay and elaborate on the current topic? If you're following this schema, you'll get these kind of clusters. You'll stay, then you'll jump, you'll stay, and stay, then you'll jump. And you can assign a probability to whether you're going to jump. And an iterated decision process with an associated probability of jumping or probability of an event occurrence, that defines a very particular kind of distribution, a Poisson distribution. And you can see that here. I just simulated some data with P being set at 0.6 or P being set at 0.17. And Poisson distributions, depending on what that jump probability is, either look very skewed like this, or they look pretty uniform, all depending on what that P looks like, that jump probability. And so when you look at our subjects and what their distributions look like, you can test that against an underlying Poisson model or versus, most distributions in psychology are going to be Gaussian, and you can test that with a Shapiro-Wilks test. And what we find is overwhelming evidence that our subjects fit a Poisson family distribution, and you can reject that the distributions are Gaussian. So there is some similarity between clump and jump and cluster and switch, which we know fits the stay-go iterated decision model, and the actual distributions of block lengths for our subjects suggests that some kind of iterated decision process is generating the data that we witness. So that's one piece of evidence that a decision process is involved in SST. Let me show another one. Controllability. We can exercise top-down control over many spontaneous responses. People are familiar with the Stroop task. So the instruction is say the ink color of the word, but you have a spontaneous tendency to read the word meaning. And so you have to control that spontaneous tendency. The anti-saccade task, a cross is here. There's a spontaneous tendency to look in the direction the cross moves, but the instruction for the task is when the cross moves, look the opposite way. So you have to control the spontaneous tendency to look that way and instead look that way. This kind of task in particular, we understand the inhibitory circuits really well in this particular case. There are a lot of tasks like this that tap the idea of responses that exhibit controllability. We can exercise top-down control over SST. Now, what is the data for that? One kind of data is that you just notice that here's a long, boring lecture that I'm giving you. Your attention is wandering and you start to mind wander and do some SST. And then you control that. Out of respect for the speaker, you start to focus on me. The Buddhists trained that kind of attention. Unless they were hallucinating, we can control SST. And there are experimental tasks where you control the emergence of a thought item. So there's all kind of evidence that we can exercise top-down control over SST. That's important because there's a lot of states that you can't control, like early visual perception, perhaps certain kinds of early semantic or grammatical processing. You can control SST. And recently, just in the last few years, a family of models have emerged of what this kind of top-down control is. And the best models for what it is its modification of a race process. So here is the race process before there is any cognitive control. And red is going to win because its slope is steeper. The decision weight attaching to red is steeper. And green doesn't have a fighting chance here. It'll only rarely win because its slope is weak. What a control process does is you can actually computationally finally disentangle. Are you activating the response you want or suppressing the response you don't want? And the lion's share of evidence is you're suppressing the response that you don't want. And Andrew Heathcote's paper, which is not available yet, but you can email the author to get it, provides some evidence for that. But what control is its modification of a race process being a minimal decision process. So here's how the argument goes. You get to a kind of a pair of arguments that link SST to agency this way. So controllability to decision. SST is top-down controllable. All responses that are top-down controllable arise from what I'm calling a minimal decision process. They're not like early vision. They're not like early semantic or syntactic processing and being resistant to controllability. Therefore, SST arises from a decision process. That's a valid argument. You can complain about whether it's sound or not, but it's valid. And then you get a link from the minimal decision to agency. If D arises from a decision process, these decision processes have a structure that what causes the response rationalizes the response. It meets the broad criterion for what it is and to bring something about in a way that's rationalized by your mental states. That's agency. SST arises from a decision process, therefore SST involves agency. So there's a pair of arguments that get you there that SST involves agency.
Let me stop you here because we have a couple questions. Gideon, Pam, and Al are all interested in your response to whether there's a difference between what you call a minimal decisional process and reason-responsive mechanisms, as Fisher and Revisa had laid out.
Yeah, you know, a minimal decision process can be a substrate for reasons responsiveness. Absolutely. Yes. I will say that a minimal decision process is characterized in a way that is a little more illuminating of what we're talking about. Recall that Fisher and Revisa, and I've complained about this to John many times, we're waiting for an account of what reason is. And he has a footnote in Responsibility of Control where he says, I'm going to punt on that. He's never said. And we need an account of what is the nature of the responsiveness. I know that John has a bunch of different criterion involving reactivity and you know, all the different criterion he has. To answer the question though, yes, I think a minimal decision process is a substrate for reasons responsivity, especially under, and may even help to make that notion more precise. Good, okay. More questions.
We also had a question from Robin Waller. I'm gonna try to let her talk.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, I don't think I can do a video. It doesn't have an option, but it's okay. So I had a question with characterizing the SST as a stay or go decision.
Yes.
Based on your analysis. So a lot of your analysis is tied to semantic analysis, whether that's inter-rater reliability of coders or it's the machine learning.
Yeah.
So do you worry about missing multimodal connections? Obviously, a lot of anecdotal stuff about stream of consciousness is like, you know, I'm thinking about a time and then maybe I remember a song and thinking about the song brings me to a completely different time, which semantically wouldn't be related. Or if you smell something and then that reminds you of, you know, some event, and that stuff wouldn't come out semantically, would it not?
That's right. That would not come out semantically. And I did kind of broach that idea that when I said, so we have statistical evidence from the method that we use that the jumps are discontinuous in the following narrow sense. A lag 1 jump is only slightly more similar to the target jump than a lag 12. I'm sorry, I may have used words incorrectly. A lag 1 block is only slightly more connected to the target block than a lag 12 block, which is really striking. And by the time you get to lag 2, there is no more, by the measure we're using, there is no more closeness between the lag 2 block and the target block than a lag 12 block. That said, these kinds of subtle connections are not going to show up in our method. How widespread they are is challenging to identify. I will say this though, even the examples you point to allow the idea of patch switching, though a weaker notion of it. If you're thinking about something and a song comes to mind and that makes you think about something else, depending on how you define the notion of a region in mnemonic space, you may very well be leaving one patch for another. But what you're highlighting, I think, is that there is a bridge that takes you from one region to another. And I think that there are these bridges. They tend to be very tenuous. They have to be tenuous. Otherwise, our method would have detected them. The bridges may very well be there.
Okay. We have, so Christoph is going to ask a question, and then we have a bunch of questions about agency that I think I'm going to suggest we hold off till the end to tackle in discussion, because I don't know how much more you have to go. But I want to make sure you can get through your presentation.
Oh, did you say that Kalina Christoph?
Hi, this is Christoph Koch.
I thought it was Kalina. Yeah, Christoph Koch. Good. Okay, sorry. I thought it was who knows this work quite well. Okay, good. Go ahead.
Chandra, this is a low-level question. To what extent is what you're finding a universal strategy found in many neurobiological systems. What I mean, particularly with respect to the stay or go or clump and jump structure of your SSTs. Many years ago.
That's exactly right. And when I said.
Wait.
Go ahead.
So what I'm specifically talking about are two instances that are quite well studied. One is if you look at flies or mites or wasps, very often when they explore a space, you can see it when you go hiking in a forest and you observe a mite. What they do, they explore locally, and then suddenly they make an abrupt jump, you know, where suddenly they fly a meter away and then they stay there for the next 10 seconds. And so it seems to be an sort of a generalized exploratory behavior. When you're tracking eye movements of subjects, when they don't have to do a search task, but under other conditions, they do the same thing. With their eyes, they hover, you know, on around a particular cluster of things, let's say people or objects in the scene, and then they make an abrupt large saccade to somewhere else, and then they stay there. And what you showed early on in this SST seems to be similar, that subjects using an associational strategy explore some particular part of a very high dimensional, you know, thought space, and then they abruptly jump somewhere else.
So, Christoph, I think that's exactly right. This is a very widespread kind of strategy. And when I likened it to foraging, I think that draws immediately to foraging is an explore, exploit kind of trade-off. You're depleting the bush where you're at. Should you continue to do that, or should you explore the space of possible bushes that might be much richer in berries? And this is a universal kind of problem that manifests in human psychology in multiple domains and often at multiple levels within the same domain. So I'm in complete agreement. I'll also, you know, plug my paper, the exploitation trade-off in mind wandering. So I actually have a paper where I wrote up these connections. It's in the Handbook of Spontaneous Thought by Kieran Fox and Kalina Christoph. And so I'm right there with you. I agree completely. And I think it's a very interesting idea that our thoughts embody a kind of foraging structure.
Thank you.
Why don't I finish? Because I'm actually close.
Okay.
And I think there'll be plenty of time for more questions then.
Great.
Okay. So I gave you two arguments for why you should believe that there is this kind of minimal decision right there in SST, kind of the way the Buddhists were describing it. And so my claim is that against Strawson and Metzinger and Hume, I'm going to side with the Buddhist picture, which disagrees with their picture on multiple dimensions. In particular, SST is not passive, it's decisional. It's not associative, and it's not subpersonal. And it's clumpy and jumpy. And the clumps are not properly described as classic associative transitions. Associative transitions are, you know, salt is routinely paired with pepper. So the tokening of the salt concept directly brings about the tokening of the pepper concept. That's really not at all. And you know, maybe introspective evidence is needed, but definitely in our transcript data, which is highly verbalized, we have to recognize that. It goes through a filter of verbalization. The structure is much better described as what in episodic memory people call scene construction. It's kind of narrative closure. It's the creation of a time, place, and process of what's going on. And those aren't associative connections. Those are classically computationally structured propositional items in a rich mesh of inference. So the picture that I have is, I think SST embodies a lot more structure and a lot more agency. I owe you this though. You know, Strawson is, and read his paper because it's beautiful. He's a very careful observer of thought, and so is Metzinger. So why exactly, and why is it just routinely believed that SST is not decisional? I put intuition here in quotes because we do have the example of the Buddhists who are operating with first-person methods who are claiming that thought is decisional and actional. So it's not a universal intuition that SST is passive and associational, but here's a couple of reasons why. There are some actions that have indeterminate upshots. You perform the action, and what the action involves is something like querying a memory system with a certain kind of probe, or what Tulving called a retrieval set, a sparsely described thing of the kind of thing that you're after. And content addressable memory works its magic, and in a little bit of time, it delivers the answer to your query. So I like Strawson's term here, the catalytic action. You agentially perform the catalytic action, and then you passively receive the result. Yes, a lot of that does happen in SST. It's important, though, that the structuring of SST is done by these catalytic actions. You are making the stay decisions. You're making the elaboration decisions. You're setting up when you find this particular region of mnemonic space interesting, and you keep going with it, and when you think it's kind of depleted, and make a decision to jump. So the IU type of action do give you a little bit of the phenomenology of receiving something passively, but we shouldn't get carried away with that. Here's another thing that nobody taught you to do clump and jump in SST. And here's another observation. You put people in the scanner, you give them a rest period before the blocks of task. Everybody's default network activates. And the default network is thought to be where the SST is kind of coming from. There's this idea that SST is a kind of universal, pre-configured cognitive praxis. I don't have to learn it. I don't have to teach my 6-year-old son how to do SST, like the way I teach him how to ride a bike. It's already part of our psychology. And a lot of these kinds of pre-configured cognitive praxis, they're not salient. I don't want to say they don't have a rich phenomenology. If you do the meditative practice, you can introspect and see the phenomenology. And that's what the Buddhists were doing. There's a rich kind of agential phenomenology going on with SST if you care to look for it. So maybe after this talk, maybe people sitting now are saying, okay, I'll do what you say. Send me an email if you find agency in SST, with the caveat that some of what you're experiencing is the passively received results of your catalytic actions. But if you slow down and introspect, I think you'll see agency in SST. Okay. SST, and here I'm really heading towards the end. SST and other minimal decisional phenomenon are the dominant way by which we manifest agency. Minimal decisions, not, so Hume called the associations the cement of the universe. And what he meant is a little bit slightly different. But in any case, minimal decisions are the sinews of the mind. This kind of minimal decision, and here is where the Buddhists are really accurate, is going on at micro timescales routinely across perceptual judgment, across our patterns of attention and visual saccades, across impression formation, across memory retrieval, across the formation of thought. This is the lion's share of what your mind is doing, is these various kinds of minimal decisions. I said already by argument, and kind of a Davidsonian kind of argument, yeah, these are the right kind of structures to convey agency. So much of our agency is manifested this way. But here's what's interesting. Our control over ongoing patterns of minimal decisions in SST and more broadly is remarkably limited. Now, I told you, you can control SST. Individual SST thought items, if you direct your mind to it, you can suppress them by various kinds of internal mnemonic suppression actions, memory actions, attentional actions, and so forth. What's really remarkable, though, is that it's hard to control ongoing patterns of minimal decisions in SST. Everybody knows Wegner's result. I should have put a citation here. Don't think of a white bear. Boom, you're thinking of a white bear. Try this, it's a variant. Think of only a white bear for the next 60 seconds, or like the meditative practice, think of your breath. That is one of the hardest things to do, and to do well. With that in mind, here's another result I want to show. We have Neo 5-factor results for all of our 61 subjects. And we fit this kind of Markov transition model to the data. Every single sentence gets assigned a semantic score, positive, no emotion, or negative. And you can look at the transition matrix that emerges. What is shown here is not the transition matrix, but the correlation of the transition matrix with neuroticism. And what you're seeing is that individuals that are neurotic have much more probability of going from a no emotion state to a negative state. And when they're in a negative state, they have a much lower probability of, they have a much higher probability of staying in it and a much lower probability of coming out of it. Another way, and by the way, neuroticism, as is widely known in the mental health literature, lies at the absolute root of depression, anxiety, and a variety of other mental illnesses. And so imagine that you're an individual with a kind of neurotic thought style. That means minimal decisions are happening in SST absolutely routinely that are turning your thoughts in a negative direction. And when they're negative, the minimal decisions are keeping you in a negative thought stream, and you're much less likely to come out of it. That's happening not 1 second, not in 10 seconds, constantly, not just during the sessions that we test, but presumably all the time. That's your kind of way of life. You get a remarkable argument out of this from responsibility and mental illness. This was actually what I was going to do the talk on, but I just ran out of time, taking care of 3 kids. It's tough. Here's the argument. Symptoms of mental illness arise from chronic ongoing patterns of minimal decisions in SST. I think I don't need to provide all the data for that, but you can see right here, neurotic thought style, and there's lots of ways arriving at that conclusion. So that's a premise. Our control over chronic ongoing patterns of minimal decisions in SST is limited and brittle. That's the white bear premise. You're getting that from Wegner. You're getting that. Why is the meditative practice of the Buddhists reserved for the elites who study many years to get that kind of practice? Because our ordinary agential capacities to regulate this stuff, at a time slice, it's okay, but generally it's just not very good. So when people talk about what goes wrong in mental disorders, I think this is a vivid example that the kind of control that's limited in mental disorders is not the kind that shows up in philosophical thought experiments involving a compulsion or an irresistible impulse. What is actually going on with mental illness is an ongoing chronic minimal decision style that you don't have ordinary agential capacities to, over the short, medium, and long term, to really regulate. And that's what's getting you into trouble. Okay, so minimal decisions are interesting. They're both the principal mediators of agency because of their ubiquity, and they're also a principal threat to agency because of their limited controllability. And the Buddhists, their psychology is intimately linked to their soteriology, their view about what is the human predicament and what is the route to salvation. So they said, look, you have these minimal decisions going on here. They're going fast. You can, you can get a little bit with these supervisory attentional capacities. You can get a little bit of insight into them and a little bit of intervention into them, but ordinary agential capacities are not enough. You need to cultivate much richer, more sophisticated skills. The modern version of this is our ordinary, and take depression as an example. Our ordinary thought style, neurotic thought style in anxious depression, there's many varieties of depression. Aaron Beck viewed it very much as this kind of neurotic thought pattern that catastrophizes, accentuates the negative, jumps to conclusions and so forth. And Aaron Beck teaches ways of intervening on minimal decisions via cognitive behavioral therapy and so forth. So there's a nice link between the idea of agency in spontaneous stream of thought to also arguments about why we lack agency in many aspects of our life. So final slide, the standard view is that SST is passive, subpersonal, associative. It stands outside agency, and agency is the deliberative stuff. The alternative view is that SST is decisional, clumpy and jumpy with rich propositional, computational kind of structure, and richly imbued with agency, ongoing agency, stay-go decisions, elaboration decisions, and the like. Your personal concerns and what's important to you manifests through these minimal decisions. But SST is not only a window into agency, it's a window into the precarity of agency and why we have so much difficulty controlling our own minds so often. With that, special thanks to my collaborator, Aman Taksali. Anusha Garg did the personal concerns study as an undergraduate. She's off to Riverside to work with Johnson Schooler. Keep working on this stuff. Lots of undergrads worked on this stuff. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Chandra. That was great. Before we open it up for questions, and I have quite a long list already of people who have put in their dibs for questions, we were going to turn to Tim and who was the other panelist? Till, for some comments or questions. So let's go to Tim first.
Okay, so I didn't know whether we were going to end up doing this since we'd been interpolating questions all along. So I guess my questions are that I put in the chat box at the end there. And Chandra, I did look at your forthcoming paper, The Atoms of Self-Control, which is kind of connected to what you're doing here. I really enjoyed that.
That's right. That's absolutely right.
So that's influencing kind of questions where I'm going. So how did you see, were you able to see individual variation in the jump structure of SSTs? That is, do some individuals show much longer thought chains before they jump than others? And then I wondered whether, and that's of course just happening in a context where you're just telling people to just sit there in the dark and think out loud. And then is there any evidence that differences there might be there among individuals correlates with individuals' broader capacity for self-control and in trying to accomplish difficult tasks?
Is my screen still being shared?
It is.
Okay, Tim, that was a terrific question, and yes. So the clump length is very closely related to the Poisson parameter, the jump probability. So what I'm actually showing here is, I know the y-axis says mean clump length, but I'll ignore the distinction. What you say is exactly correct. CARS A is the Conners ADHD rating scale. And so individuals that have this end of the axis is a higher jump probability or a shorter jump length. Individuals that have a foraging style in which they visit a region of mnemonic space and they very quickly are bored with it and jump to the next space, have higher Conners rating scores, indicating that that jump probability parameter is a trait-like individual difference variable. So that's an excellent question, and that is something that all along we wanted to look at, and so that you are correct.
Okay, and presumably this also correlates with people's ability to engage in much more long-term, sustained kinds of projects. You know, it's not a kind of discrete action, but it's like multi-year, you know, getting a PhD type goals and sort of what do we know about what is involved in what kind of processes, what kind of internal strategies, conscious or otherwise, are going on in individuals who have this ability to maintain focus for very long periods of time on goals versus people who you know, get diverted, and does it connect up with what you think is going on here in this very localized sort of episodic, very short term?
Yeah, I mean, if you ask a question like, what enables some people to pursue a long-term, multi-year kind of project versus other people don't, I would say that you would get a bunch of additive and multiplicative interactions between lots of different processes. Right. And one of them certainly would be a foraging style like this And so I don't want to impugn individuals who have a foraging. And a lot of this has a morally valenced kind of aspect that I want to stay away from. I'll point out that I directed an ADHD clinic for a while. I have a lot of interest in helping individuals with ADHD, and I don't want to moralize against a foraging style like this. But I do think that a foraging style, a cognitive foraging style like this, makes it very difficult. It creates a kind of a problem in which individuals are routinely disorganized, forgetful. You look at the DSM criterion for the inattention aspect of ADHD, you can kind of read off that this kind of cognitive foraging style is likely a very big contributor. Lots of other things impede people's ability to pursue long-term projects as well. And there's various kinds of adjustments that a person with this kind of foraging style can make to pursue long-term projects. But you asked, is there a connection? Yes, I would say that it's going to be more challenging to pursue long-term projects with a cognitive foraging style like this.
Okay, let me turn it over to Till.
Hi there. That was wonderful, really very interesting. So I'd like to start by getting a little bit clearer on the notion of agency in minimal decisions and how big your disagreement with Strawson really is. So, so at the end of the paper that you quote, the mental ballistics paper, Strawson says, look, there's one way, obviously, in which you could disagree with me. That's not really a disagreement. You could say, well, there is this spontaneity, this Kantian spontaneity, reason responsiveness, something like that. And during the chat, you said at some point, you answered a question that maybe what the agency in minimal decision making is something akin to reason responsiveness. So I was wondering whether you thought, or maybe that's the agency. I suppose then Strawson would agree with you and say, well, yeah, okay, that kind of stuff might happen, but it's not intentional action. It's not what we ordinarily mean when we talk about agency, which is intentional action. So then it's almost an agreement. And
yeah, and here's where I don't know all that's entailed by the notion of a reason responsive mechanism. I mean, it's been pointed out, I believe, by Angie Smith in several places, maybe by Pamela Haronmi, who I think is on this call, that look, belief arises from a reason responsive process. And, you know, perceptual belief arises, I mean, reason responsive could be construed so broadly that even perceptual belief arises from a reason responsive process. And in virtue, and there's a lot of different ways you can go, but that, to me, that very broad notion of a reason responsive process is not the same thing of what I mean by a minimal decision. So to home in a little more closely in what happens in a task like the Iowa gambling task, the algorithm that I'm granting has important dimensions of which are subpersonal, computes commodities like this Q value attaching to a state or a state action pair. A state is a little easier to think about, like the state of choosing deck A. And as Baccara says, you have these hunches, and it's important, I think, to the view that I would like, and that's why I'm saying that there's gut feelings here, that there is person-level recognition. Recognition is too strong. Person-level access to the states that both cause and rationalize the ensuing response. In which case, I say, and so that does constrain the perceptual, early perceptual belief formation. That doesn't have that kind of quality. It doesn't have that kind of phenomenal character. And the Marian, 2D sketch, nothing about that is globally broadcast and available to consumer systems such that those states cause and rationalize the resulting belief formation. Or maybe I'm wrong. I mean, I haven't actually given that so much thought, but the way that I would like to pull apart just basic rational necessitation that goes under the name spontaneity in the historical literature, or that would be applicable to things that are obviously not voluntary and not candidates for agency, like early perceptual belief, is the role that the value currencies play in being available, access available to diverse cognitive systems, making them the kind of thing that are a person-level state. I hope that was helpful in at least setting up a little bit of distance between where I am and where Strawson is. And he's talking a lot about McDowell and other thinkers are in being very permissive of where agency is. I'm not quite there. I am carving out a narrower space where a broad category of things that involve this kind of value computation and drift to boundary get picked out.
So I suppose in the answer, I then had the feeling you might be drifting the other way, and that's why I felt like it sounded a little bit like Strawson, because here, when we talk about the hunch scenario, and then you act on the hunch, you kind of make your decision based on this hunch. It looks like we are talking about something like a voluntary behavior, and you said now in your response as well that this might be voluntary action. So do you think that minimal decisions are in some sense voluntary decisions, or do you think that that's the wrong term to use? Because I mean, obviously that would be, then it would look like really proper Strawson catalytic actions. I mean, that fits really nicely with the Strawson picture, that there's a shepherding behavior that changes the space in which your processing is ongoing, and in that way helps you cognize in a better way. But this is now proper voluntary action as we ordinarily understand it.
The shepherding actions that Strawson has in mind, he's not perfectly clear of what those are, and there may be different gradations for what he has in mind there. So to take the mental action, and so I'm of that happens during SST. So let's use SST as our target case. You have a thought in mind, and let's go to this person way at the beginning, so we have something concrete. And
let me break in here. We have 10 people on the list with questions, and 8 minutes. I mean, I don't know whether people want to go longer, but I'm going to encourage you to be brief.
Okay, I'll be very brief. And I will say that I would like to ask Galen, what is his view about the kind of minimal value computation, the Stego decision type, and the type of shepherding action that I have in mind that goes on in SST? Are those robust enough to count as catalytic shepherding actions on his scheme? My sense is that he may say yes, or he may say, I haven't thought about it. But Tillman, I think is the name. I think you're pushing it exactly the right place. I need a more careful account of minimal decisions that distinguishes them from other kinds of cases that I don't want to include, like early perceptual belief formation. And so I need to improve the account of the minimal decision.
Okay, so I have on my list Manuel, Tim Hicks, Pam. Ned's question may have been answered, so if it is, he can pass, and then we'll go down further if we've got time. So go ahead, Manuel.
Thanks. Yeah. So
Hey,
let me just follow. I guess I want to follow up on Till's question here. So one of the things that reasons responsiveness fans sometimes distinguish between accounts that go for mechanism level reasons responsiveness and accounts that go for agent level reasons responsiveness. And so I guess I want to ask a question that I've pressed on you before about whether or not there's some other reason you'd be worried about if it turns out reasons responsiveness fans of the agent level sort said, no, this is you're giving us exactly what we want. That is, you're giving us a story about, as you put it, the kind of substrate for what reasons responsiveness would have to look like. And of course, there's the point, I take your point earlier that we still might ask the question, what do we mean by reasons? And then somebody's going to say something like information that bears on the aptness of the action or something like that. And so so we might have that exchange. But I'm wondering, is there another reason? Is there a further reason you might want to resist the characterization that you've just handed a set of tools, as it were, that the agent level reasons responsiveness fan couldn't just say, yeah, I'm just going to take off the shelf Chandra's story here about this, and that's my story of what the underlying mechanisms are that then produce agent level reasons responsiveness.
That's an incredibly helpful point. I had forgotten about the agent level versus the mechanism level. And I've always actually had, until it kind of crystallized right in your question, what are the advantages of going one way or other? And we've talked about this before when I've said certain objections that I have apply equally well to both. Now I do see one advantage of agent level reasons responsiveness. It fits better with what I'm trying to get at with the notion of a minimal decision, because minimal decision is constrained in the ways that I was saying to be caused and rationalized by states that the currency type value calculation states that are present at the person level. So another way I could have done this talk is that agent level reasons responsivity, which is a sub domain of reasons responsivity theories, and nicely does carve away the problematic cases of things like early perceptual judgment. That agent level reasons responsivity and minimal decision are correlated notions and mutually illuminate each other. And the upshot of my talk is that the Buddhists put agency, for example, at the level of SST because they conceived of agent level reasons responsivity as sufficient for agency. And they also understood that that kind of agency can be problematic in various ways. So in other words, I didn't have to use minimal decision. I could have recast it that way. I view that as a friendly amendment. And when it comes time to write this up, I think that's actually a nice way to go. So I appreciate that.
Okay, we're going to turn to Tim Hicks. You should be able to talk, Tim.
Yeah, thanks, Chandra. That was a wonderful talk. And I suspect that the answer to the question I'm going to ask doesn't really change, won't really change the implications that you've illuminated. But, and I'm sure you've thought about this, but what would you say about the impact of the experimental conditions, the requirement for expressive verbal reporting as impacting the thought stream itself?
Yeah.
Would the SST be different if you didn't have to report? And then the other thing, if you would just touch on it, you mentioned the question of the nature of reason, which of course is related to the basic question of what the nature of the self is, or the self-sensation. Would you share any thoughts you have on that?
The very last quick question, could you say that again?
Yeah, that you mentioned what's the nature of reason, and you punted that, of course.
Yeah.
But that relates, of course, then to what is the nature of the self,
yeah,
and what I call the self-sensation. Would you share any thoughts you have on that subject?
Good. The methodological issues in a talk like this are really interesting, and you know, let me say a couple of things about it. One is verbalized thought unmistakably changes what would have happened otherwise. Importantly, we're not Freudian analysts trying to get at the content of your unverbalized thought. Importantly, what we're doing is using verbalized thought as a model system.
Yeah.
So Drosophila is a model of human genetics. Tit for tat is a model of cooperation. A beautiful example is Darwin's artificial selection as a model of natural selection. Model systems can differ from the real system. In fact, if you know that they differ, and they differ in systematic ways, you can, in some ways, adjust for that. We want a way to figure out what kinds of transitions are happening in unverbalized SST. Of course, we can't see that. So we use a model system that differs from the target system, but we hope that the linking processes, the transitions, are importantly shared between the two, that we can learn something about unverbalized by studying verbalized. That gets some of the way to getting over the fact that, yeah, we do change the content when we verbalize it. So that's one important thing. On the idea of self, one more thing about methodology. One of the reasons we did this is because mind-wandering research, people may know, works by thought probes. So you give somebody a long, boring task. Let's see if I have a slide for that. And you periodically interrupt them. And like this kind of task, you have to press a letter every time you see an X. And X shows up, they hit the space. They're doing this for minutes, dozens of minutes. Periodically you ask them, what were you thinking about? That thought probe method that dominates the current literature on mind wandering, it can only answer when mind wandering occurs and under what conditions. Those are fascinating questions. But if you're interested in what we're interested in, which is the sequential structure of the SST, you have to go to the kind of methods that we used.
Yeah. Makes
On the
sense.
issue of self, I have very little to say, unfortunately.
Hang
yeah,
on one second. It is 3 o'clock, which is when we're supposed to end. I'm going to propose, if nobody has an objection, that we spend another 15 minutes and try to get through more of these questions, and whatever we can't do in 15, you can answer by, we'll forward the questions to you.
Absolutely. I'm happy to answer more questions. I'm very glad and enthusiastic that people are interested in this. So yeah, and as always, feel free to email me. I'm always willing to talk about SST.
Okay, so I have up.
Adina, sorry, 1 second. I will have to leave, and I just need to say quickly before I leave, just to remind people that actually, and you're involved in that, we have on July 20th another seminar on the readiness potential. What does it mean for conscious volition? That's by Adina Roskis, Aaron Sugar, moderated by Tomasz Dominik. And sorry for having to leave exactly on time, but just wanted to remind people of that. And otherwise, please go ahead.
Thank you, Uri.
Yeah, so I have Pam, Ned, Malti Hendricks, Gideon and Mark, and then I doubt we're going to get to the rest of the list.
Oh, he answered my question already.
Okay, so Pam, how about you?
I'm going to cede the floor.
Okay, so Malti Hendricks.
Hey, Malti, how you doing?
Let's see, I'm allowed to talk. Can you talk? Malti?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. Great talk. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Malti.
I was wondering, in the arguments you presented towards the end, the two arguments, there was the, if D arises from a decision process, then D involves agency. And I was wondering how broadly or narrowly we are to understand arises here, right? So the thought is whether one could have like a deviant causal arisal process, so to say. So I thought, for an example, imagine I currently follow a topic of thought, and there's an expected value calculation maybe going on whether I should go with this stay with this topic or go. And before this calculation is resolved, even though it would have resulted in me staying with the topic because the value is positive, the demanding and complex nature of this very calculation just strains too much of my mental resources maybe, and I succumb to another topical stimuli that I could not suppress simultaneously to the demanding calculation. Right here, I feel like the decision process did give rise maybe to topical change, but maybe not in the correct way, right?
I love, first of all, I love that example. And there is no doubt that this is not an attempt to repair problems with the Davidsonian framework. So the Davidsonian framework, as you're correctly alluding to, the notion of cause and etiology being sufficient to characterize the relation between the motivating states and the response, you need to cause in the right way. And I haven't said anything about that. So the decisional approach and saying that there's a decisional basis to the things that we want to count as actions doesn't remedy the problems in the causal approach at all. Now, so that's correct. I accept that. I'm not going to offer on the fly any type of solution, but I'll throw this little tidbit out there. Methodologically, I think the question is ill-posed. In general, in science, we don't find these kinds of necessary and sufficient conditions that link cause and effect. In other words, deviant causal chains show up almost universally in any scientific theory. And so it's not clear what to make of them. And action theory isn't unique in this respect at all. So I just am not motivated to try to fix this problem. If you have a solution, I would happily accept it, but it doesn't worry me so much.
So I'll jump back in because that was my question.
Okay.
And but so once you say, well, it's not sufficient. It's sure it causes and rationalizes.
Yeah.
But causing and rationalizing isn't sufficient. Tons of things cause and rationalize. So what's the basis of, you need, granted you're not going to get necessary and sufficient conditions. On what basis are you suggesting that this thing that happens to cause and rationalize should also be called a decision?
Right. So there's a couple of different ways to go at this point. One is to the Davidsonians out there. I'm like, the singers, they go, people from New York. I'm like, to the Davidsonians out there, are you with me? This is an easy bridge for Davidsonians struggling with the idea that conscious belief and desire get together in the right way to cause and rationalize an action. People already sold on that kind of picture and are struggling to know what to say about making your morning coffee and saccading your eye and things like that. Well, here's a bridge for them. Extend your notion from beliefs and desires to things like minimal decision processes, and you get a much more flexible account that accounts for a lot more of our agency. That's one way for me to go, and it doesn't answer your question. It just says to the Davidsonians out there, this is what you can do. More broadly, I'm not in a very good position to decisively answer your question. I kind of hinted to Malta the direction that I would want to go, which is this problem infects all of science. So somebody a lot smarter than me and a lot more capable is going to have to figure out this kind of metaphysical conundrum. But it probably won't be me. It's an unsatisfactory response, but I'm guessing though that Pam, that you may have an adequate response to fill this gap, maybe that I could take on board. In which case I have to go back and reread exactly what that solution is, and maybe I could take it on board. I probably have, if it fits within the overall account, I could probably take it on. I can get Manuel's help, I can get your help, and I can have a more attractive theory. That may be the right way to approach the issues you're pointing out.
Okay, since Pam doesn't seem to have a response there, I think we'll move on to, I have Gideon, Mark, John Dylan Haynes, and Walter on my list.
Yeah, I think the stuff I wanted to press has been pressed, so I'll pass.
Okay, Mark Hallett.
Right, so I wonder if you have done any of these studies in the MRI. You obviously do a lot of MRI in your work, so is there any MRI brain correlate of this type of SST that you're talking about?
Yeah, we've run about 20 subjects through the scanner in this exact protocol. The data was hard to analyze because we had to remove the scanner noise artifact to do the transcriptions. And overall, that is a work in progress. We have not analyzed, we have collected the data, we have not analyzed the imaging data at all. And, the kinds of questions that we would ask is, one of the main questions is, what is the nature of that jump process? And can we get any grip on how that kind of process works? I'd also like to illuminate the decisional nature by looking at various kinds of regions associated with value computation and see if there's any links to what happens in SST, whether you can get any purchase on these stay-go decisions. So that's the next kind of direction. Actually, though, so 20 subjects is not a lot, especially these days with a lot of these data sets. You know, we collect several hundred subjects and things like that. I would like to get funded from this line of research. So especially the link to neurotic thought style. And there is greater appreciation that the construct called self-generated thought. I don't love that name, but it's basically what SST is an important construct in psychiatry and cuts across kinds of different diagnoses. So the order of operations may be write up what we have, get funded, and then run a legit large fMRI kind of study of this.
So have you looked at other forms of pathology other than ADHD?
Well, the neuroticism result is linked to depression.
Right.
And those are the two big low-hanging fruit because they represent dimensions of variation. And remember that our subjects are all healthy undergrads. And so these are dimensions of variation that you get robust differences in a healthy population. There are no doubt, and we are collecting a very large sample of bipolar coming up in another kind of experimental context. There are no doubt differences in these kind of serious mental illnesses like bipolar and schizophrenia. That's just going to be very, very difficult to collect and analyze. But it's not that the construct is not interesting there. It's just much more challenging to study those kinds of things.
Thank you.
Okay, John Dylan Haynes and then Walter, and then we'll call it a day. John, you there? Nope, maybe not. Okay, so Walter.
So Chandra, great talk. I wanted to get clear on what the thesis really was, because you start off by saying there's this passive view and I'm going to argue against it. But actually in the end, it sounded like you were saying, well, some aspects of SST are active, but there's still a lot that are passive. Yeah. And so just to get straight, I'd like to apply it to a concrete example. Imagine that you've got an addict who is directed to, go through this process and starts doing SST, and their mind jumps to drugs.
Yeah.
Now, is that active? Does the person have a control? Are you saying they make a decision to think about drugs? What exactly are you saying about that jump when they were thinking about the meal last night and all of a sudden they start thinking about drugs?
Yeah, and they make it even a stronger claim. Let's say that they are vowed that they will remain abstinent, and that's not mouthing the words. Deep down, drugs have wrecked their life, and they don't want to think about drugs.
Right.
But they're having a meal. Somebody says the word cake, and it reminds them of cocaine cake process where you make crack cocaine, let's say, the word cake. And so now they're thinking about drugs.
Got a C and a K in it, so it's an association, yeah.
Yeah, it's an association, right. I'm riffing here, just work with me. Okay, I just now said that they've vowed sincerely that they don't want to do something, and yet here they're doing it. How can I call this a decision that they've made? And I think that that's exactly the puzzle of the style of agency that we have. And this gets into the territory of mapping out. The best way to explore this kind of terrain is with a model system that you can look at. And the Stroop task is a great model system because it instantiates exactly the kind of problem that that we need to think about and get clear on in what sense are you making a decision. So let's do a moralized Stroop task where I tell you that if you make a mistake on the Stroop and you don't read, you don't say what the ink color is, instead you give the word reading response, I'm going to go kick your dog. So you're now motivated to not make any errors on the Stroop, and you're motivated in particular to do the the ink color naming response. But on trial 57, you do the word reading response. You know, the button box is in your hand, and instead of giving the ink color, you say red in accordance to that stimulus. What is going on there is that a minimal decision is made to read the red, to read the lexicographic information there. It's a lesser decision because there is a supervisory system that has more information, that in this local context, you're supposed to be doing something else. It is possible to make a decision that opposes your overall goal and you might say higher cognitive intention. We can be in those kinds of states because we have an importantly kind of compartmentalized psychology or segregated psychology where there's more than one decision system at play. There's an argument that Al and I have had in person and in print. So I'm saying things that can be contested, but the overall picture is that just because you make a decision that, in making a decision that is caused and rationalized by the right kind of states, you manifest some agency. And there can be cases where you make decisions that oppose your sincerely held and avowed overall goals. And that's the really kind of interesting kind of states that we can be in. And the neurotic individual, that's a little microcosm with the Stroop task. The neurotic individual is chronically in a state like that. Let's say their therapist says, if you're going to get out of this depressive funk, you're going to have to challenge these automatic thoughts. But the automatic thoughts, they're continually making these kind of minimal decisions to brood on this, overgeneralize that, and so forth. So I think that is the human predicament. We make decisions routinely that oppose some of our goals. Yeah.
So I just want to make, so just in my example, so your answer is yes, the addict in the SST decides to think about drugs.
Yeah, and it sounds, yeah, it sounds odd because
you're an agent.
The addict, yeah, in the minimal decision sense, elaborates on the particular thought of using crack and stays with the thought of using crack. Yeah, and does this in a way that manifests agency. Absolutely, yeah. It would be mysterious that they could exercise top-down control to stop that or learn to cultivate to stop that if it wasn't a manifestation of agency, because they certainly can't change their eye color that way.
Okay.
Yeah. Good. I think that was the last question.
Adina?
Everybody is gone except you and me, Walter.
Oh, no, I'm here.
No.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, I was muted and I didn't realize it.
Okay.
Okay. So
I want to thank everybody.
3:15. We want to thank you, Chandra. That was great.
Good.
Yeah, thank you, Chandra.
Yeah, and thanks to everybody for inviting me and staying engaged with the topic. I really appreciate it.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thanks again.